Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast with your host, Jacob Berman. Today I'm joined by Dr. M. David Litwa. He has appeared on this channel a few times before. I'll have the links to those videos in the description. I also have the link to his Patreon page as well. So if you want to go check that out, definitely head over there and become a patron to get access to his videos on his YouTube channel. All the relevant links are in the description below. And I'll have his Amazon page in the description as well, so you can check that out as well, so you can go purchase his books. All right, let's get right on with it. So we're talking about different factions of Gnosticism, like the Valentinians, the Sethians, and we also touched on we talked about the Marcionites before and why they're referring to them as Gnostics is a bit hairy, because they're not technically Gnostics, and we talked about that before. But there are certain parallels between the Marcionite religion and the Gnostics to a degree, and we've talked about that before as well. So also the Mandaeans. I almost forgot to bring up the Mandaeans. It's even in the title. Okay. So I'm going to start us off with this question. What do you think are the main, most important differences that should be highlighted carefully between the Valentinians, the Marcionites, and the Sethians, and the Mandaeans? Because a lot of these Gnostic sects have a lot of similarities, but there are also very sharp differences between them all. Could you talk about that?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to see you, and I'm glad to be here. Jacob always asks difficult and involved questions, but I'm going to do my best to give you the rundown of the latest scholarly thinking on this particular topic. So we have essentially a situation where there are multiple Christian groups, and there are some who refer to themselves as Gnostic in unofficial or non-technical sense, that is, as spiritual or enlightened knowers. And that's definitely true. And we definitely have heresiologists telling us that there are different sects of Christians, among them Saturninians or Saturnilians, Marcionites, Valentinians, Carpocratians, and Basileides. So, but whether any of these Christians would identify as a Basileidean or a Saturninian or a Valentinian, we actually don't know. I would hypothesize that these Christians would simply, first of all, self-identify as Christians. But for us, there's a difference between emic and edict discourse. So although a religious group might self-identify as a Christian, the fact is there are very different kinds of Christian groups, and that continues today. So just as, a Methodist today might refer to themselves as a Christian and not a Methodist, we can still obviously refer to Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, so on and so forth, even if that version of their identity isn't the most forefront in their mind. In terms of their social identity, they identify as Christians. There's never a Christian that self-identifies as a Valentinian or a Basileidean that we know of. But they were there, and they did have distinctive Christian circles and groups. So Valentinus, I've talked about both on Neil's Gnostic Informant channel, and it's also on my Patreon. Valentinus is Alexandrian, and he forms a circle, and he has a distinctive take on theology, and he's one of our very first Alexandrian theologians. Okay, so he's Hadrianic, which means that he arises during the reign of Hadrian, which runs from 117 to 138. And all that survives of Valentinus is 7 fragments. And So these fragments take priority over the later heresiological reports. So you want to go to the fragments first before you go to the heresiological reports. And Valentinus is sometimes said to have also penned the Gospel of Truth. I'm quite sympathetic to this idea, but because it's so disputed, again, you want to go to the fragments first and then go to the Gospel of Truth, and then you can take a look at the heresiological reports. So basically, Valentinus, just to summarize the fragments, they aren't systematic, but he says things like angels created the world, and that a seed of superior reality was invested into Adam, and that Adam spoke boldly to the angels, and the angels, after they had created Adam, recognized a seed of superior reality, and then they tried to destroy Adam. Valentinus also says that human beings are immortal by nature, and that they have the possibility of dominating corruption within them. And as an example of this, he says that Jesus dominated corruption within him, and as a consequence, he did not defecate. So Jesus is the great counterexample to the dictum in the children's book, everyone poops. That's just not true. Jesus didn't. So now this isn't ascetic because Jesus had a real body. He just had a perfect body. And let's face it, if we could have a body that didn't defecate, we'd go for that too. So at any rate, those are the kinds of things that Valentinus says. We also have a beautiful hymn of Valentinus called Summer Harvest. And we know that the very first Christian psalm book that is of original compositions was penned by Valentinus. So that's pretty amazing. Now, Basileides is a contemporary of Valentinus, maybe even a slightly older one, and he's also in Alexandria. So we don't actually know, but we assume that they met each other on the street or knew of each other. We just have no sign of interaction. But Basileides, we're doing a little bit better with him because we have about, well, let's see, I don't recall the exact number, but we have, I think, around 20 fragments of him and many, many different testimonies. And Basileides also gets a heresiological report in Irenaeus, but you probably shouldn't trust that one. And we also have a very long rendition of Basileides' theology in the Refutation of All Heresies. That one, interestingly, it's a creation story, and it's pretty wild and wacky, so I highly recommend it. But again, we want to prioritize the fragments, and according to the fragments, Basileides talks about a variety of things. Okay, we know that he composed the first exegetical commentary on a Christian gospel, for instance, called the Exegetica. We know that he formed a circle of Christians with their distinctive rituals because they celebrated the incarnation on January 6th or 10th. We know that for Basileides, the incarnation was at Jesus' baptism, not through his birth through Mary. We know that for Basileideans, they also sang hymns, and some of them were composed by Basileides. We know that Basileides proposed the first Christian doctrine of transmigration. We know that Basileides opposed martyrdom and said that martyrs die for their own sins. And we know that Basileides interacted with other texts that don't survive, a prophecy of Bar Kabbas and Bar Kof. These are unknown prophets, but apparently he read them. And he commented on Persian theologies, and he was very worldly and cosmopolitan and interactive. And we don't know if his theology, we don't know if his group survived anywhere outside of Alexandria. Interestingly, Jerome, all the way in the 5th century, says that Basileidean doctrine had reached Spain and conquered, Christianity in Spain. But most scholars don't actually believe that. But the fact is, Basileides and Basileideans remained a very strong presence among Christians in Egypt up until about the 4th century. So that's Basileides. Now, Remind me of the other group you wanted to discuss, Jacob.
Well, I mentioned the Mandaeans.
Yep. So Mandaeans are a bit of a different story. In the early 20th century, Rudolf Bultmann, a famous New Testament scholar, thought that the Mandaeans were the first Gnostics and that they were Jewish Gnostics and that they were pre-Christian Jewish Gnostics because that they had appealed to John the Baptist. And that's true. The interesting thing about Mandaeans is that they survive. They're still around. They're still here. I don't know their recent history, but at least up until the Iraq War, they were in southern Iraq, in the ballpark of about 15 to 20,000 people who are self-identifying Mandaeans, and they're still here. So that's something important to recognize. Not all of these groups actually died out, and this is a good example. But the question of how early are the Mandaeans and where exactly they emerged from, that's all very mysterious. None of their texts predate the 4th century. And what we probably think today is that Bultmann was probably wrong. They're probably not pre-Christian. They emerge among 2nd century baptizing groups, and probably somewhat similar to the Alkasites. Alkasites were the baptizing group that Mani, head of Manichaeanism, grew up in an Alkasite group in Iraq. And we know that there were many other baptizing groups who had integrated Christian ideas, but also were holding on to Jewish ideas and were essentially hybrid forms of the religion. We know that they also thrived in the 2nd century around the areas of Jordan. And so what probably happened is that this one particular group moved east, further into Iraq. They began composing literature. If you meet a Mandaean today, they will tell you that they think John the Baptist is the head of their tradition. But then when you look at their texts, you see that John the Baptist actually isn't that important for them. But they do claim to be Gnostics. Mandaean just means Gnostic, or Manda means Gnostic, and Mandaean means Gnostics. So they do claim to have special knowledge, and they definitely have some family resemblance with some of these other groups. But the idea of them being the first Gnostic group has been basically thrown out. It's no longer plausible. So that's just important to keep in mind.
Yeah, from what I know about them, they claim it appears that they think that John the Baptist is the Messiah, or he's the important guy that everybody should be looking at. Forget about Jesus Christ. The patriarchs in the Old Testament are false. They think Yahweh is evil, and a similar view that Marcion has, a similar view that the other Gnostics have, that Yahweh is evil. He is the demiurge. But they take it a mile higher, and they say, okay, let's toss Jesus out too. He's a false prophet. The real dude is John the Baptist.
Well, so I have to admit, I'm not an expert in Mandaean thought or theology, but all that I can say here is that we don't have access to what, say, 2nd century Mandaeans, assuming that they existed, actually thought, because all of their texts date back to the 4th century. So their main text is the right Ginza and the left Ginza. These are old texts, but they're not as early as Basileides, Carpocrates, Valentinus, those great Alexandrian theologians in the Hadrianic period. And also, when you look at the Ginza literature, John the Baptist, again, he doesn't actually appear that much. It doesn't actually appear to be central. So it's all very, I would encourage people to study the Mandaeans as part of the late antique phenomena of baptizing Christian groups claiming special gnosis. Or I should correct myself, they're not self-identifying Christians. They're not self-identifying Jews. They essentially become their own thing, but they're borrowing and hybridizing Jewish and Christian traditions and claiming that as special knowledge. So that's about all I can say safely. I can just recommend that readers or your viewers go and look at the left and right Ginza and see what you can find.
I know in one of the previous discussions that we had, we were talking about Marcion being defined as a Gnostic, and you were advising caution and defining Marcion as a Gnostic. There's a tradition that he was taught by a Gnostic called Cerdo. What do you think about that tradition that Cerdo, the Gnostic, was the teacher of Marcion?
Well, so I'll call him Cerdo, but yeah, it's a Greek kappa there, which comes in English as C. So yeah, you might think it's Cerdo, but Cerdo was never really called a Gnostic. He's only said that he comes from Syria, and unfortunately, he is just sort of like a blank. Now, so all that we know is that the heresiologists claim that Marcion was taught by Cerdo, but we don't know what Cerdo actually thought. Now, when you read some heresiologists, they fill in the blanks and they try to convince you that they know what Cerdo thought, and it basically just looks like what Marcion thought. So I think they're just sort of doing a bit of reverse engineering. They actually don't know, and we have to be very cautious here. But I think what we can safely say is that Marcion was interacting with several groups. Marcion himself is from Pontus, which is northern Turkey, Asia Minor. So he's coming in contact with people, but he's also a ship captain. So or a ship owner, and he's very well traveled. So one can imagine him going to places like Syria or Egypt. Certainly, we know he came to Rome, but he's probably been all over the Mediterranean world, and so his influences might be quite broad. Now, the Sethians, which is another Christian group, or the seed of Seth, which I talk about in my book, Found Christianity, probably, well, scholars debate this, but probably this is an early Syrian group. And this early Syrian group has a kind of forerunner in the person of Saturninus, sometimes called Saturnil. And Saturninus has a theory of an evil creator, and it's one of our earliest theories. And it appears that he's devising this again right in the Hadrianic period, and Marcion is also Hadrianic. So we don't know of any direct connection between Marcion and Syria. All we know is that he had a teacher from Syria who probably knew the Syrian theology of Saturninus. And so possibly Marcion came under the influence of Saturninus in some way to develop his theology. And by the time Marcion becomes an old man, he's got his own version of the evil creator, but he was interacting with other theologians. Alternatively, we might think of Marcion and Saturninus coming up with the idea of the evil creator, at roughly the same time, and some sort of mutual influence. But the history here is so sketchy, we can't really even say that. But suffice it to say that various Christian groups are coming up at the same time with the notion that the creator is evil. And so Marcion isn't exactly unique in that. What makes Marcion so famous later on is that he's the great church organizer. So his theory of the evil creator gets expanded, and he also writes to justify his theory based on scriptures, Jewish and Christian scriptures, in a book called The Antitheses. And so this really gets, the heresiologists upset. Saturninus, we don't know what happens to him, and we don't know what he wrote. So his influence is a lot more restricted to Syria, and he sort of disappears. We know that there are Saturninians, possibly at Rome, because Roman authors mention them, or Justin, who's at Rome, mentions them, Justin Martyr, and Hegesippus, when he's at Rome, also mentions them. But were they at Rome? We don't know. Marcion definitely was. And Marcion becomes the big enemy and target of early Catholic theologians. But that's just because he had the loudest trumpet.
Mm. So we have a super chat here.
Sure.
Jess Lee, thank you for the $5 Australian. I cannot believe I finally caught a live. It's hard in Australia. Much love to you both. Well, thank you, Jess. Thank you. I'd like to remind everybody, if any of you have questions, super chat them. Okay, so are the Mandaeans basically Gnosticizing? I know that John the Baptist, as you said earlier, is not mentioned as many times in the Mandaean text that exists at all. Unlike what some people believe that, oh, he's actually in there many times when he's really not. But in any case, to the extent that he's there, are they basically Gnosticizing John the Baptist's theology?
Well, we can't really say that because we don't know John the Baptist's theology. All he appears as is a sort of wild-eyed prophet dunking people in the Jordan. And for any development, we have to really turn to the 2nd century, where we've got multiple baptizing groups that are now starting to do the hard work of theology. So the Elkosites, possibly the Mandaeans, several other groups as well, who have died out and are just now today called Jewish Christians, so-called Ebionites, Nazareans fall into this camp. They're all hybrid sort of Jewish Christian groups, some of whom claim special secret knowledge. Some of them don't. Some of them may claim to go back to John the Baptist. Some of them don't. And so it's all quite confused. But I would really recommend your listeners to go check out the Elkosites, because of all the groups, we know about them probably the most. And we have a brief section in the Refutation of All Heresies on the Elkosites in Book 9, because an Elkosite missionary, Alcibiades, goes to Rome and spreads the Elkosite message in Rome. So we've got a direct witness to their message, and we've also got some surviving quotes from their texts. So if you want 2nd century early developments, that's where I would go. If you're interested in the late sort of 4th century texts, again, you can check out the left and right Ginza that the Mandaeans still use as their scripture today, and then kind of figure it out for yourself. But if you want to do history, it's very difficult to piece together what was actually going on in earlier centuries from the later Mandaean literature, and that's just the problem we face.
In light of these Gnostic groups claiming that Yahweh is an evil god, he's the demiurge, he's the devil himself, do any of them still consider, do any of these groups, Gnostic groups, consider Jesus a descendant of King David? Because they tend to believe, since Jesus was the son of the god they call the monad, through the virgin birth, well, depending on which one of them believes in the virgin birth or not, and the son of the monad of Mary, or do they just believe that he's the son of Mary while rejecting the genealogies in Matthew and Luke's Gospels?
Well, it's a bit difficult to generalize, but
Hmm.
from what we hear of the heresiologists, their chief criticism of these Jewish Christian groups is that they view Jesus as the actual son of Joseph.
Hmm.
So, yes, he isn't a divine being. He's a human being and a prophet, very similar to how he gets viewed later in Islam. They consider him the son of Mary and the true son of Joseph. And so, yes, largely speaking, they might not accept this particular genealogies of Matthew and Luke, but I think they would definitely fit Jesus into a genealogy, and also like Islam, into a genealogy of prophets. Now, for them, if you look at Manichaeism, you have Mani growing up in an Alkasite group, and then creating modifications to that particular religious formation, and then creating his own world religion. And in that case, yeah, there's no hostility to Jesus. Jesus is a light bringer. He's a prophet. And this pattern of seeing Jesus as among the prophets, but simply not the culmination, is something quite common in these Eastern forms of Christianity. And Islam is what taps into that and promotes that. So it really is all connected. And that's generally the way things happen. And some of these groups claim to have secret knowledge, some don't. Some of these groups will claim to have gnosis, but some won't. So it's all a bit sticky here.
What are your thoughts on Walter Smithall's claim that Paul had encountered Gnostics in his day?
Well, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 8 that we all have gnosis. I know that in the English translations that doesn't quite come out, but he uses the Greek word gnosis. He says we Christians, we all have gnosis. And in context, he's talking about what he calls an eidolon, or an idol, represents. That is, it's not a real God. And so when you want to go have a party at the local temple, you shouldn't have to worry, because you know that the beautiful idol, the beautiful statue, cult statue of the deity, doesn't represent anything. It's not standing in for a true deity, so it's not a threat to your faith. That's the logic of 1 Corinthians 8. And then he sort of changes his tune when you get to 1 Corinthians 10, that the idol represents a daimon. But apart from that interpretive issue, there's definitely the claim as early as Paul for Christian gnosis. The issue is gnosis hadn't become a technical term, So Christians all throughout the 1st and 2nd century are saying, yeah, I've got gnosis. I've got enlightened knowledge. I've got secret knowledge. And you have Christians starting to refer themselves as Gnostici or Gnostikoi. That is, the Prodicans, the Carpocratians, the Nacenes. Okay. Some people think the Sethians claim to be Gnostics on the basis of Irenaeus. So they're making a self-claim to gnosis, but that claim doesn't mean that they're creating a new religion. No, their main category, they're all claiming to be Christian, but they're claiming to be an enlightened Christian. And this is really important because even Clement of Alexandria claims to be a Gnostic, and Clement of Alexandria gets absorbed into the Orthodox tradition. Okay, but if you read his Stromata, and especially book 7 of his Stromata, it's basically his guidebook for how to become a Christian Gnostic, and he's using that term left and right. So it's used in a non-technical sense throughout this period, And groups are in competition because different Christian groups are claiming to have different secret knowledge about Jesus. And why are they claiming that? Well, it's because they have different apostolic traditions. Some claim to have information from Matthias. Basileides claimed that. He claimed to also have secret information from Peter through a man called Glaucius, otherwise unknown. Valentinus claimed to have secret information about Jesus from the Pauline tradition through a guy named Theodos, otherwise unknown. So, but depending on who you are, Marcellina, who's a follower of Carpocrates, claims that she has female disciples whom she appeals to. So Salome, Mary, Martha, and Salome. All of these ladies, Mary being the first witness to the resurrection, Salome being also appearing in the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel according to the Egyptians as an intimate disciple of Jesus, they all are bringing in more secret traditions supposedly from Jesus, and that secret tradition doesn't agree with the secret tradition that the Christians across the street are claiming to have, but they're all Gnostic in that non-general, non-technical sense. In other words, they're claiming, just like Paul, to have gnosis. So Paul gets this discourse started, but that's miles away from saying that in Paul's day everybody knew the technical term of what a Gnostic was. It was, you have a myth of fallen wisdom of Sophia, and you believe that the creator is evil, and that you believe we all have a divine spark, and basically a laundry list of items for what makes you a Gnostic. Well, that just doesn't appear in Paul. But the important thing to know is that all those Christians, or almost all those Christians who are claiming to have Gnostic traditions, that is, traditions of secret and enlightenment, are basing themselves on Paul. Paul is the first one to say, I have secret information from Jesus. I know a man 14 years ago who was caught up into the third heaven and heard unutterable words. Well, that's secret Gnostic tradition, right? And it's coming from Paul. So in that very non-technical sense, Paul already is a Gnostic. He's already claiming to have secret knowledge from Jesus. But he doesn't have a myth of the fall of wisdom, and he doesn't believe we have a divine spark, and he doesn't think the creator is evil. So there you go.
Could Paul, being basically like a proto-Gnostic, I suppose, could that be involved with later Christian traditions that claim that Paul is the founder of Gnosticism? Because there are some Gnostic traditions that claim that he's the founder of their religion, and then later on they claim it was actually Simon Magus instead.
Well, absolutely. So Valentinus uses Paul, Basileides uses Paul, Carpocrates uses Paul. We don't know about Saturninus, but Marcion uses Paul and comes up with the first sort of canon, or a list of authoritative books in which he has 10 Pauline letters. So they're all using Paul, and they all consider Paul to have secret information from Jesus. And they're all interpreting Paul. And some of the things that Paul says really does make you think that the creator is evil. And some of the things that Paul says makes you think that, humans have a divine nature, innate. And some of the things that Paul says, a good example of this is Paul refers to fleshly people, and he refers to psychic or soulish people, and he refers to spiritual people. That's all in 1 Corinthians. And so the Valentinians then formalize this and say, well, there's three kinds of people in the world. There's the fleshly people, the soulish people, and the spirit people. And we're the spirit people. The Christians across the street are the soulish people, and everybody else is material. So essentially what they're doing is they're formalizing those very loose categories that Paul is using, and they're adapting the Pauline tradition in a more systematic way. So the Paul is the founder of that tradition, and it is Gnostic wisdom that he brings. But he isn't viewed as, the first Gnostic, and they don't call him that. So that's just important to keep in mind.
How different is, based on what we do know for sure about the Gnostics, how inaccurate is Irenaeus in his portrayal of them, and or how accurate is he in his portrayal of them?
Well, a lot of people like to say that Irenaeus is basically accurate. And I'm one of those people who says that that's not the case. And whenever you're reading heresiology, you should have your skeptical eyes and ears open. The reason why people go to Irenaeus is because he seems easy. I mean, he gives you these almost like encyclopedic entry reports on, here's what Simon of Samaria says, here's what Basileides says, here's what the Valentinians say, here's what Carpocrates says. And it all seems very nice and neat, and it's nicely packaged and accessible and available online. And so people use it. But that doesn't mean that it's accurate. Now, why do people think that Irenaeus is accurate? Well, it's interesting. They look to Nag Hammadi, and Irenaeus has a section on the sort of the evolution of the Godhead in his Against Heresies 1, chapter 29. And a section of that looks like our Apocryphon of John, found at Nag Hammadi. But what's important to keep in mind is this is a case where Irenaeus has a source. It's probably not the Apocryphon of John. It's probably an earlier just theology that was later incorporated into the Apocryphon. When Irenaeus has a source, he is generally faithful, but for most of his material, he doesn't have a source, and he's not copying out or summarizing anything but a previous heresiological report. And I should really have a separate episode on this, but the way that heresiology develops is that we think that Justin Martyr gave us the first heresy catalog. And Justin doesn't have any texts, but he tells you what Marcion thinks, and he tells you what Simon of Samaria thinks, and he tells you what Menander thinks and what Saturninus thinks. And these are all like local figures he knows because Justin himself is from Palestine. So he's interacting with the more Syrian figures. So he has this information, and then basically someone edits this material, and then Irenaeus takes this over in what we would call plagiarism, and then simply copies it out and adds stuff to it in his own heresy catalog. But since none of that material is based on primary source texts, or it seems to be based on primary source texts and could be based on rumor and hearsay and slander, all of that material has to be used with caution. And what I constantly advise students and interested folks who want to know more about these early Christian groups is I say, when you have fragments, genuine fragments, those must always take priority. And then you check Irenaeus against the fragments, right? So you don't wake up in the morning and say, I want to learn about the Basileideans, or I want to learn what Basileides thought. Well, please don't go to Irenaeus first. You have, fragments of Basileides, and I've posted these on my Patreon. You've got lots and lots of things, quotes from Basileides and his son Isidore, things that they actually said. And then when you go and compare the report in Irenaeus, you see that it's completely different, and it's wild and wacky. And the actual fragments of Basileides don't confirm almost anything of what Irenaeus said. So that's reason for skepticism, right? One great example of this is if you go to Irenaeus and you want to learn about Basileides, Irenaeus says that the chief god of Basileides is Abrasax, and that Basileides believed in 365 heavens. And then when you go to the fragments of Basileides, you never find that. So is that material true? Well, we have nothing to confirm it. And I would say that you can't just repeat what Irenaeus says, Because remember, Irenaeus is trying to destroy these people. And he's not overall concerned about accuracy. He's concerned with destroying other Christian groups, undermining their reputation, and kicking them out, basically. So when you keep those things in mind, yes, you shouldn't repeat things that Irenaeus says, because they're not necessarily true. And we don't know where Irenaeus is getting some of his information.
It almost sounded like that he was basically making fun of them and exaggerating their beliefs in that manner.
Absolutely. No, I mean he uses all of the stereotyped rhetorical polemics, they're sexually immoral, they practice magic, which is a crime under Roman law, they commit adultery. I mean, the whole grab bag is in there, but he's got not a single case proving any of that. Because the other Christians would just say, we're not using magic, we're using miracles. And even you believe in miracles, Irenaeus, and Irenaeus talks about miracles. But one person's miracle is another person's magic. But it's all a rhetorical device, right? And Irenaeus says that these people are complete sexual profligates and having wild orgies and corrupting other people's wives and spouses. But when you go check them out, it doesn't add up. There's no names named. And when you compare the theologies, for instance, of Marcus the Valentinian, adultery would be abhorrent to him because your true husband is your angel. So for him to even desire other human women is theologically strange. And the fact that women follow him doesn't mean that he's having sex with them. But of course, Irenaeus connects the dots, right? And it's, of course, easy for skeptics of religion also to connect the dots. That's not to say that we know everything about Marcus the Valentinian. It's just that, when all that we know of Marcus the Valentinian is written by someone who wants to destroy him, well, you might want to be skeptical.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's really that really contradicts what Irenaeus that claims that Irenaeus is accurate. That's a problem. So I've been wanting to ask you about the tale of Helen and Simon Magus, in which Helen, Simon Magus's girlfriend, is apparently the reincarnation of Helen of Troy, according to some Gnostics. Is this some sort of is this their own way of could it be their own way of comparing the Jewish revolt to the Trojan War by claiming that Helen of Troy returned in the 1st century?
Well, I wouldn't jump there, but what interests me about this story is that it's another case where we see that a Christian group is believing in transmigration. Okay, so normally we think of transmigration as a Pythagorean or a Platonic Pythagorean teaching, and it is. But the fact is, early Christians had developed it. And although in Orthodox Christian theology today, you won't find transmigration or reincarnation, it was a thriving element of early Christian theology. So we have Simonian groups, we have Basileides, we have Isidore, we have Carpocrates, we have Marcellina. All these are Christian theologians who are saying, yes, transmigration is true. That's God's system of punishing people. Because there's no hell. This world itself is Hades. And God chastens souls by having them be reborn. So Helen is an interesting case because when you look at the earliest Simonian document, which is the Great Declaration, Helen doesn't appear. By the way, that shows you that the Great Declaration is itself fairly early because the earliest mention of Helen is in Justin Martyr, and Justin is writing around 150. So that information about Helen is heresiological. They say that she's a prostitute or that she was a prostitute living in Tyre, the city of Tyre. Is that true? I don't know. I mean, think about it. One of the chief purposes of heresiologists is to destroy the sexual reputation of others. And so if they can portray Simon as basically having sex with a prostitute and claiming that, she, which is different, it has to be separated from the claims about her role as a transmigrated person. I mean, we have to be somewhat skeptical. But I think what we can say is that Helen was a very important person in later Simonian thought, that some Simonians by the 170s were called Hellenians, so that she was probably viewed as a teacher of wisdom. And Simonians were reading their Homer and engaging with both Homer and Christian scriptures. So they were affirming doctrine of transmigration. So this is the sort of stuff that you can, I think, reliably pull out of this report. But the idea that actually there was a historical Helen who was a prostitute at Tyre, whom Simon redeemed, that story, I don't know if any of that is true.
Jess Lee, thank you for the $10, 10 Australian dollars. And Golem One, thank you for the $20. Really appreciate these super chats, people. If any of you have any questions, feel free to super chat it. I've heard that scholarship often considers Gnosticism to be present within what is considered a pseudo-Pauline epistle, that is 1 Timothy. Do you think this is so? And if you do, would that affect the dating of the letter? And if so, when would you date it then?
Absolutely. Well, the dating game is one of my favorite things of all time. And so the famous passage in 1 Timothy 6 that Irenaeus actually refers to, and he's the first person to refer to it, because Irenaeus writes a book and he called it The Refutation of Overthrow of Gnosis Falsely So Called. And he's alluding to that passage in 1 Timothy 6:20, where this writer, he's not Paul, but he's pretending to be Paul, refers to Gnosis falsely so called. And so we wonder how much this author knows. At a bare minimum, he knows that Christians are claiming Gnosis, right? And we know that that's very popular in the 2nd century. So we already have an inkling that this is quite a late letter. But what really shows that this is quite a late letter is that in that very same passage in 1 Timothy 6:20, he refers to the antitheses. And although this doesn't show up in the English translations, and I don't have my text handy, but this doesn't show up in the English translations, but he refers to the antitheses. And this, interestingly, is an actual book title of Marcion. Marcion wrote the antitheses, and we know that Marcion wrote the antitheses about 150. So if the author of 1 Timothy is alluding somewhat cleverly to the antitheses, then we definitely know that he's after 150. But of course, there are other ways that first of all, that this isn't Paul, that this author is referring to, the official office of bishop, which Paul, never knew anything about the official office of bishop, and he would have cared less. That he was a very charismatic person who didn't set up rigid church offices. So the fact that the author of 1 Timothy is referring to rigid church offices is a great sign that he's quite late. The fact that the author of 1 Timothy is also trying to silence women in the churches, very unsuccessfully. But that's what he says. Women, he says, please don't speak. Well, he says it in a bit of a nastier way. He says, let women be silent. And the fact is, he's not describing anything. He's trying to prescribe their silence because women aren't silent. And he insults them by saying, you know how women are saved? Well, you're saved through childbearing. Which, when you think about it, is a really nasty way of going about it. How are the men saved? Well, we don't. I don't know. I mean, through faith, and the women through childbearing. And so, I mean, this is an author who's supporting procreation, trying to put women in their place, keep them in the home, keep them quiet in public. And all of this is indicative of a situation, again, probably late, at least mid-2nd century and beyond, where an author is actively trying to, first of all, say that church offices are only for men and that women shouldn't have leadership roles. So who is he arguing against? Well, women who had leadership roles. And we know that Marcellina was active in the Roman Church in 150s and 160s, 170s probably. She was independently leading a Roman church in our church in Rome. And that's a perfect example of someone that the author of 1 Timothy just wants to shut up. But it's also a great example of how late this particular letter really is. And how dangerous it is for people to think that 1 Timothy was written by Paul or that it belongs to the 1st century, which is, I think, not only a lie, but a dangerous one.
We have a super chat from Jess Lee. Thank you for another 10 Australian dollars. They always degrade egalitarian male spiritual leaders who include women by saying they only associated with them for sex. I've heard it recently even. Misogynist projection.
Thanks, Jess. That's absolutely right. The way that heresiologists demean women is they say that, yes, we know that there are women involved in the early church, women like Helen, women like Mary Magdalene, but and women like this deacon's wife that Marcus the Valentinian interacts with. But the only thing important about these women is that they are misled or seduced by men, and that they are sexual objects and tools. It's interesting that the tradition of Mary Magdalene as a prostitute is very late. It's not in the New Testament. It's not in the 2nd century. It's quite late in late antiquity, but it's a perfect example of how the Orthodox tradition demeans women, because Mary Magdalene in the Gnostic tradition and in the Gospel of Mary is a teacher. She's an apostle of the apostles. She's valued for her intellect and the secret traditions that she brings to the table. I mean, the male apostles like Peter and Andrew can't stand it, but she knows and is loved more by Jesus than other people. So that's the Gnostic Mary. She's an intellectual. She's a teacher. She's a wise woman. She's a sage. And the fact that she is now remembered as a prostitute, even a redeemed one like Helen, is just a crass, the crassest kind of distortion that you often see used by men who just want to dismiss her as what she really was for thousands of Christians in the 2nd and 3rd century. She is the teacher. She is the apostle of the apostles, the apostle to the apostles. And that's what she was remembered for.
We have a super chat from Hot Black Desiato. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Thank you for the $5. Are there different types of secret knowledge propounded by various Gnostic groups? If so, can Dr. Litwa briefly discuss them?
Absolutely. I'm not sure if I can do it briefly, but just keep in mind that gnosis, the Greek word gnosis, just basically means that it's knowledge spiritual knowledge that is typically kept secret, and it's kept secret, but it's delivered by an apostolic channel that is not widely recognized. Okay, so Mary Magdalene brings secret tradition. Matthias brings secret tradition. Sometimes it's said that Peter brings secret tradition. We have an Apocalypse of Peter and Nag Hammadi. We have, the Gospel according to Egyptians, which no longer survives. Salome is there bringing the secret tradition that she heard from Jesus. So depending on what you're reading, that secret tradition will be different, because Jesus is going to say different things based on the tradition, right? And I'm not claiming, of course, that those are true traditions of Jesus. I mean, probably nothing, as far as I'm concerned, can be proved to go back to the historical Jesus. But it's very similar to the portrait in Mark, if your viewers are familiar with that, where Jesus is telling parables, and then in private, he says, I'm just going to tell you the mystery of what I mean by these parables, and the mystery is only going to go to you. And the Greek word there is mysterion, which is knowledge that you would get as in a secret cult ritual. So, but depending on what text you're reading, that knowledge will be different. So, for instance, in the Gospel of Mary, it's knowledge about taking away your passions and ascending to heaven, removing the demons of anger and of rage and of jealousy and of desire. That's the message of Jesus. If you read the Gospel of Thomas, it's more like getting rid of, the secret teaching is more like getting rid of the external trappings of religion and understanding that Jesus as the divine light is hidden within you. That's the secret tradition. If you're reading the Gospel of or the Apocalypse of Peter from Nag Hammadi, well, then the secret tradition is that the bishops and deacons are evil, that they've fallen away from the true tradition. If you're reading the Testimony of Truth, again from Nag Hammadi, the secret tradition is that martyrdom is a sacrifice to an evil god. Same thing if you read the Gospel of Judas. Okay, Jesus gives Judas secret tradition, and he says, stop sacrificing. It's as if you're killing women and children. I don't want any more blood. God doesn't want your blood. Why do you do those things? You're confused about who God is. You're mistaken about the true God that I'm bringing to the table. So oftentimes the sacred tradition is that the God you've been worshiping is a false God, and that there's a primal or unknown deity above that God who is the true God. And that's the secret message. So yes, absolutely. Christian groups are bringing to the table various versions of the secret, private information that Jesus supposedly told his disciples at different times, in different places, to different people. And that's how they get to, claim to be Gnostic, because they have access to that secret tradition.
How do you feel about Marcion priority?
What do you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, as you probably are aware, there are scholars out there like Matthias Klinghardt that think that Marcion wrote the first gospel, and then the rest of them are based on him, and they think it's much later.
Okay, yeah. So that's a great question. I have great respect for Matthias Klinghardt and for Marcus Vincent, and I encourage everyone to read their books. But the problem is, okay, so Marcion never claims to have written a gospel. And not even any heresiologists claim that Marcion wrote a gospel. So the theory that Marcion wrote his Evangelion, and that this Evangelion then became the basis for the other Gospels, it's not based on solid enough data, right? I mean, Marcion himself, the more I get to know Marcion, the more he seems like a traditionalist. He's bringing forth a text that he's familiar with, but he never claimed to write it. And he would be, I think he'd be horrified if people accused him of writing it. And the fact is, people never accused him of writing it. What the heresiologists accuse Marcion of is editing a version of Luke. But Marcion never even claims to have changed a single word. And then when you go read the heresiologists like Tertullian's like, yeah, Marcion edited the Gospel of Luke. And I'm going to go line by line and show you where he edited it. And then as Tertullian is working his way through Marcion's text, Tertullian is always making these comments. Well, Marcion should have gotten rid of this part, but didn't. Right? It's like, and Tertullian keeps saying Marcion is very foolish because he should have cut this part out, about Moses and Elijah appearing with Jesus in the Transfiguration, because Marcion supposedly thinks that these Old Testament figures are bad, so they should just have been deleted, but they're not. And then Tertullian is all confused, right? So if Marcion is the editor of his own text, he did a terrible job, and that's exactly what Tertullian says. But the problem is that Tertullian's claim that he's an editor is something that Marcion never claimed. Now, I mean, I acknowledge that texts change. I mean, texts change every time they're copied out. But it doesn't mean that Marcion even had the education to systematically either write a gospel text or to systematically delete everything that he didn't like. The fact is, his version included all sorts of information about John the Baptist, about Jewish lore and tradition, and about Jewish heroes. And it's not a text that looks edited at all. And I really encourage everybody to go read Marcion's Evangelion. It's now been reconstructed and translated into very nice English by Jason Badun. And the text you need to get there is called The First New Testament.
I actually have that.
Yeah, that's the place to go if you want direct access to the Evangelion. Now, every Evangelion reconstruction is a reconstruction because it's reconstructed from quotes, but still, I mean, that's a whole lot better than Q. Because we don't have a single quotation from Q. It's never been found. It's never been referred to. So Marcion's Evangelion is reconstructible, and Jason Badun in his notes is a great guide in English. So I can't recommend that anymore. And then for those of you who want to learn more, Matthias Klinghart's great book, originally published in German, is just published last year. I believe it's the oldest testament or something of that nature. Can pull it off my shelf, but I don't want to leave the screen here. But yes, definitely go read that and judge for yourself. It's just that for every claim that you make, you have to have evidence.
We have another super chat from Jess Lee again. Thank you for the $20 Australian. Is it true that the Orthodox believed they were being anti-elitist and protecting the simple Peter-like people from overly complex ideas that would lead them to confusion and error? Or is it just cynical power grabbing?
Well, it's a great question, and I want to look at it part by part. I don't know if Jacob, you can keep that question on the screen.
It back. Yep.
I think for someone like Irenaeus, and even for someone like Justin, and later people who get absorbed into the Orthodox tradition, I think that they present themselves as intellectuals. And so all intellectuals are elitist, to some degree, because they say we know more than other people, right? So, and if you read all of Irenaeus's work, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's like brilliant, but it's a complex theology. And as Christianity moves forward in time, you've got more and more Christians like Irenaeus, like the Refutator, like Justin Martyr, Tractation, and going on the line, who want to appear as intellectual and philosophical. So, because that gives them social and cultural capital, and they want to appear this way in part because they're responding to Valentinus and Basileides and Carpocrates, who are the really, to my view, much earlier and original and innovative theologians. But the next couple generations disagree with them. But one of the things that they take from Valentinus and Basileides and Carpocrates is they take this intellectual and philosophical cast, and they also want to appear intellectual and philosophical. And that gives them social and cultural capital amidst those, people in the pews. Of course, in the 2nd century, there's no pews, but you know what I mean? The basic Christian who can't afford education, because you're a slave or whatever, or, if you're born a woman, your education stops when you're age 14. And so there's lots of early Christians like that. And then they look up to, the intellectual bishop who's teaching them and interpreting the scriptures. And this model of Christianity actually still exists today. I had friends, growing up when I was just in college, and I would ask them serious theological questions, and they'd say, you know what, you have to ask the bishop about that one. I don't really know, and really I don't really care, because the people who are producing the theology are those people in the church hierarchy. But if I understand your question, I mean, everybody, in a sense, is using that intellectual and philosophical mode of engagement. This is the area where theology is being invented, and then they are presenting that theology mostly to other intellectuals, but then so-called, more simple and uneducated Christians look up to these people. And the way that the people like Valentinus and other, or people like Irenaeus and the other heresiologists, the way that they try to defeat Valentinus and his heirs is they try to look more intellectual than the intellectuals. And that is, you could call a kind of power grab.
How do you feel about, I suppose, what one could call quasi-Marcion priority? Like, okay, some Gospels predate Marcion, a couple of them post-date Marcion. It's something that Mark and Matthew predate Marcion, but that Luke is actually expanding Marcion. And what they do is they claim that, well, Luke's text is larger than Marcion's Gospel. Marcion's Gospel is shorter than Luke's Gospel. So to them, it makes better sense that Luke's Gospel is expanding Marcion's Gospel rather than the other way around, that Marcion is shortening Luke's Gospel. What do you think about that?
Well, that's where Matthias Klinghardt and I think Marcus Vincent and others who are really looking at this, that's where I think they are at their best and they have their best point. Okay. It's not that Marcion generates the first gospel and then everybody else copies that. But it is the case that canonical Luke, with the big birth narratives and then the expanded resurrection accounts and all this, added detail and this wonderfully grandiose texture, that definitely looks like it's a revision of Marcion's text. And so they absolutely have a point when they say that, you think canonical Luke is the first form of Luke. No, that's wrong. Marcion gives us access to the first form of Luke, what Luke looked like around the year 100. And your canonical Luke, with that nice preface that's added and all the birth stories and that cute story about Elizabeth and the birth of John the Baptist and Gabriel coming to Mary, all of that has been added. And so that rooting of Jesus in terms of the Septuagintal tradition, all of that has been added. In Marcion's text, Marcion's version of Luke, The very first scene is Jesus coming into Capernaum and casting out a demon. That's the very first scene. And so in Marcion's version of Luke was in that respect much more like our canonical Mark, where Jesus just, boom, he appears on the scene. He's not born. He comes out of nowhere, but he's already casting out demons. That was Marcion's Luke. And that the expanded version in canonical Luke. And Klinghardt goes to you point by point and says why we think this is later, why we think this is an edited version. It's neater, it's bigger, it's more complex, it's improved stylistically. All of those things are improvements on a previous text by someone with an actual editorial method. And we can see that editorial method at work. See, the problem with Marcion is Marcion didn't have an editorial method, right? And this is Klinghardt's point, that the heresiologists are all saying, he should have deleted this material. If he was a good editor, he would have deleted this, right? He would have deleted all this material about Jesus being prophetically, announced by the Hebrew prophets. All that shouldn't be there. But that's all over Paul. I mean, you would have to delete 25% of the Pauline material because Paul is quoting, Jewish scripture left and right. Marcion had no problem with that. And he wasn't prepared just to go into a set of letters and just start deleting. It's just not the case.
So basically what you and Matthias Klinghardt are saying, if Matthias Klinghardt is also saying this, is that there was a proto-Luke before Marcion, and then proto-Luke got modified after Marcion to look pretty much into canonical Luke that we have now?
Precisely. That's exactly right. Yep. So the third gospel, Luke, it was a revision of a previous text, and we don't know what the previous text was called, but we can call it Proto-Luke if you want. But for Marcion, all of these titles, Luke, Matthew, John, they're all added later. So for Marcion, when he first encountered that text, it wasn't called Luke at all. It was just called Evangelion, which means good news, gospel. And there's one gospel, okay? Not four, which is ridiculous. Why would you have four? That all contradicts in some ways. It just makes no sense at all to Marcion, right?
Do you think that Mark and Matthew went through similar stages like Luke did before it became the canonical text that we have?
Well, in a sense, yes, I do, because Matthew is an expanded Mark, right? It's well, to us, it's the greatest pull-off of plagiarism of all time, because almost everything in Mark is preserved in Matthew. Okay, so if you go, and line up the texts, and you can do this right in Greek. There's a synopsis. Just buy yourself a synopsis. You look that Matthew has preserved almost everything in Mark, and that if Mark didn't exist, we could reconstruct it from Matthew in theory, right? So yes, how do Christian gospel writers operate? Well, they're not original, right? They'll just use and plagiarize the previous text and greatly expand it. So what does Matthew do with Mark? He expands the message of John the Baptist. He gives Jesus 5 speeches, among them the Sermon on the Mount, the discourse to the disciples in Matthew 10. He expands the eschatological discourse. He adds resurrection appearances. But it's in the end, it is simply an expanded Mark. And it preserves, I don't know what the percentage is, but it preserves the vast majority of Mark. And it's simply an expanded, more stylistically improved, and more readable text. And that's why Matthew became so popular and Mark sort of drifted into obscurity.
Do you think the Gospel of John, when it was being written down, was it familiar with canonical Luke, or was it written before Canonical Luke and after Proto-Luke and Marcion, or in between Proto-Luke and Marcion?
Yep, good question. So since we know Canonical Luke had to have been born right around 150, published with Acts, then I am, my hypothesis would be, and I think it's a very strong hypothesis, that the author of John's Gospel is familiar with 3 other synoptic Gospels, but the Luke that he's familiar with is Proto-Luke. It's not Canonical Luke. So that's another reason why, some people like, well, Luke is earlier than John, but why doesn't John include this wonderful story about Elizabeth and the birth of John the Baptist and Zachariah in the temple being rebuked by the angel? And that's just a beautiful story. And Gabriel coming to Mary. I mean, that's the Christmas story. Why would John omit that stuff? Well, he didn't, because his version of Luke didn't have that. That's canonical Luke.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It really does. So John, basically, one can tell it's like you were just saying, it's familiar with the earlier version of Luke because of it's by measuring the ignorance and distinguishing between Canonical Luke and Proto-Luke via John.
Right. Yeah, he doesn't mention any of the stuff that's peculiar to Acts or to Canonical Luke. And another great example of this is, John doesn't include any of the cute Christmas story, stuff, the shepherds and stuff like that, or and he also seems to think that, Jesus' ascension happens immediately, or fairly immediately after the resurrection, because when Mary meets Jesus in the garden, Jesus is one of the things he says to her is he says, I'm ascending to my Father and to your Father, my God and your God. Yeah, and he's like, I am ascending right now. I mean, it's a present tense, anabino. I'm going up right now. But if you read Canonical Luke and Acts, well, it's the first time that any author said, no, there's a rigid separation between Jesus' resurrection and his ascension, and they're exactly 40 days apart. Well, John doesn't know that. That hasn't been invented yet.
In Canonical Luke, Luke Acts, is there any presence of what could be called Gnosticism in Luke Acts?
Well, so if Luke Acts, if my theory, which isn't only my theory, but I'll just call it my theory, if my theory is correct, that Canonical Luke is a revision of the Luke that Marcion had, call it Proto-Luke, is fine, or simply the Evangelion. And that when Canonical Luke was published, it was published together as a sort of diptych with Canonical Acts. Because whoever wrote Canonical Luke also wrote the first church history, right? You would have to call both Canonical Luke and Canonical Acts the first anti-Marcionite manifesto, meaning one of the editorial purposes of Canonical Luke and Acts is to undermine Marcion. But because the author wants you to think that he's writing in the first century, and he's borrowing a text that was probably written in the very late first century, then the attack against Marcion and the attempt to undermine Marcion, that is Marcion's version of Paul, is very subtle. I mean, obviously this author can't come up and say, Marcion was wrong about X. But what he can say is, I know Marcion's version of Paul, and I'm going to portray a version of Paul in Acts that's completely different than what Marcion thinks. So I'm going to portray Paul as following all these Jewish customs, even though that's bull. Even if you read Paul's letters, but the author of Acts is like, yeah, I'll get Paul to Jerusalem. I'll shave his head. I'll have him circumcise Timothy. I'll get him to Jerusalem. I'll have him shave his head and fulfill a vow in the Jerusalemite temple and make a sacrifice in the Jerusalemite temple. Would Paul ever do that? No. Would Marcion's Paul ever do that? No. Would the Paul of Acts do that? Yes. Is Acts written with an attempt to counter Marcion's version of Paul? I think so.
The Simon Magus that's in Acts is clearly portrayed differently than the Simon Magus that appears in later church father literature and Gnostic literature, where Simon Magus has basically been redressed as a Gnostic, but the Book of Acts does not seem to indicate that he was a Gnostic. What do you think caused Simon Magus to be rewritten as a Gnostic?
Well, there's two things going on there, and this is a very exciting question, because if the author of Acts is finishing up his product in, say, the late 140s, then he's more or less contemporary with Justin. Okay, Justin Martyr. So when the author of Acts probably knows that there's Simonian Christians around. So what he does is he tries to destroy Simon's reputation. Okay, so Simon, first of all, becomes a Magus, and Magus basically means quack. And this is why I never use Simon Magus, because it's just a slur, right? So it's Simon of Samaria. He gets demonized. He gets called the great power. He looks like a self-deifier. But one thing interesting that the author of Acts does is, he portrays Simon as a baptized Christian. And, that's a fascinating admission. And I think what that's reflecting is that Simonians were portraying themselves as baptized Christians. But what the author of Acts does is then he makes Simon look like basically an idiot, that he wants to buy the Holy Spirit and that he wants to be better than Peter and John. And that he sort of goes away, he looks like an absolute pathetic character, because Peter's like, you and your money go to hell. We don't need you. You have no part here. I mean, when you read it, you really think that Peter is the real jerk. And Simon is like crying. He's like, you guys pray for me, okay? And then he leaves. And that's the end of Simon. That's what the author of Acts would like you to believe. That's the end of Simon. But of course, we know from Justin that there are Simonian Christians in Rome, and probably in Syria, and maybe even in Alexandria at the time. So Simon hasn't gone. His effect continues. And the author of Acts, just like he's attacking Marcion, attacks the Simonian Christians by making their supposed founder look like a greedy idiot, frankly. That's the subtle.
What do you think about the claim that Simon Magus is mentioned by Josephus Flavius as a Simon the charlatan? I think he's from Cyprus, if I remember correctly. And he's a magician that goes to see Governor Felix, and people say, oh, that looks like the story that we're told about Simon Magus in Acts, or the Clementine recognitions, or whatever, or this Gnostic or that Gnostic text. What do you think about that claim that the Simon the charlatan and Josephus and Simon Magus are the same person?
Well, I'd have to freshen up on that passage in Josephus. But what I can say is that since, according to this theory, that the author of Acts is late, then we can be fairly sure that he knows Josephus. And so the things that he writes, for instance, about Theudas and about the Galilean and other figures that appear in Acts, that he's getting that from Josephus. So I think it's quite likely that he might have gotten bits and pieces of information from Josephus about Simon, maybe even from other people not even called Simon, and then reassembled them. That's possible. Or at least that Josephus is influencing the author of Acts on some level.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining me, Dr. Litwa. This has been a very fascinating discussion. At some point down the line, I would like to do a show with you specifically on what you were talking about regarding Justin Martyr earlier. And I want to expand in that discussion on church father inaccuracies and their portrayals of Gnosticism.
Sure thing. Yeah, that'll definitely fill the time. There's a lot of errors in there, so we'll go to town.
Okay. Well, I'll see you all tomorrow when I publish my next video.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Jess and everybody for showing up. Take care.
Yeah. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.